In this video, which has been sponsored by Audible, but more of that later, I'm going to be talking about the tremendous difficulty that armies have getting their soldiers to actually get in there, to get to grips face to face with the enemy and get the job done, closing with the enemy. There are many obstacles to this, and I'm going to be taking much of my material from this book, which is called War Games, although it has another title, confusingly Brains and Bullets, by Leo Murray. It's been produced by a small group of like-minded individuals who are trying to get their ideas out there, and it seems that they are at least tolerant of my being a vehicle for just that. Now, one thing that will help get guys go forward is good leadership. If you've got a good leader telling them to do it, then they're more likely to do it, right? One of the big problems with leadership, though, is that no one has worked out exactly what the hell it is. What is it that makes a good leader, and how on earth do you teach it? Now, true, there are many gurus out there who will, for a fee, you understand, allow you to attend their seminars in which they will tell you the secrets of leadership. But it seems that they're probably charlatans, because militaries all around the world have been trying for centuries to work out a way of teaching leadership, working out what the hell it is that makes a leader a good leader, and they have all failed. Now, there was a US Naval Academy that had a peer rating system. So at the end of the course, once the various students, let's call them, had been taught all the various things and been tested on all the various things and had various marks, so people knew, roughly how well they were doing, there was a big final test, and they would select the leader for the big final test by getting all of the candidates to vote amongst themselves. It was peer rating, and they would vote for the person they wanted to be their leader for the big final exercise, which was very important to their final mark. Now, the US Naval Academy actually dropped this practice and replaced it with officers teaching the course, picking the person that they thought ought to be leader. And the reason was a political reason. The reason was no woman had ever been selected to be the leader of the final task, and they thought that this was in some way wrong. The problem with this is that if everyone agrees, if everyone votes, this is the person we want to be led by, that actually makes them a good leader. If people want to be led by you, you are a good leader. You've got that magical thing which you've all picked up on, and it inspires you. And because it inspires you, that makes you a good leader. But maybe the people running the course haven't picked up on it, and they think, well, no, let's look at the marks, and these people have done better marks, and actually it's so-and-so's turn, and they may come up with a really terrible reason and a terrible choice of leader. The person that naturally somehow has just got it and makes all the other people think, yeah, I want to be led by that guy, he's a good leader. But how can you work this out? By teaching it? It seems not. By criteria, tick boxes, by some sort of mathematical algorithm? Nope. But if you get people to vote amongst themselves, whom do you want as a leader, then you get someone who is a good leader. At least in small groups. I'm not saying this necessarily consistently applies with democracies, for instance, but you get the general picture. Now, one of the things that consistently comes up in what makes a good leader is he's someone who wouldn't order you to do something that he wouldn't do himself, and he sets an example. He leads by example. If he wants troops to get stuck in with the enemy, he gets himself stuck in with the enemy. Follow me, men, and he charges forwards, and that inspires the men so they charge after him. Although actually a friend of mine, when he did eventually become an army officer, but the first time he applied, he failed the entrance tests. And one of the reasons that they gave was that he led almost entirely by example rather than by giving orders. So they obviously wanted someone who could do both. So being able to set an example is a good way of inspiring people. And leaders have different jobs in war. So for instance, with the platoon, you've got the platoon officer who's perhaps a captain or more often a lieutenant, and he might be trying to get the guys to go forwards, and he's looking at the big picture. And his sergeant is a very useful guy, but he's not the main guy who says, right, follow me guys, we're going there. His job is more to do with going laterally, to going out to the flanks, to moving outwards left and right, conveying the orders of the officer, passing his plan so that everyone knows what the plan is along the line, and sorting out any local problems he comes across. Hang on, why are you guys out of position? No, you need to be there, and you need to be shooting at those guys over there. Right, okay, and then across to the other side, and if anyone's not doing their job, to flipping well get them to do their job, and jollying everything along. Now, of course, any sensible lieutenant will listen to his sergeant, particularly if the sergeant is more experienced. But ultimately, the commander of the platoon is the officer, and he's the guy who says, right, guys, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go that way, and we're going to do it now. And he could, if he's in a Hollywood movie, make a speech, a stirring speech in which he appeals to things like patriotism, duty, honour, think of the people back home, protecting your wives and children back home. But actually, in a real battle, none of those things plays any part. Those ideas go completely out of the window. The bullets are flying about the place. There are guys thinking, am I in danger? Could I be in less danger if I moved somewhere else? Where are my friends? Where are my friends? Where are my friends? That's a particularly important one. Where are my friends? And what are the orders? And is my gun still working? And you're thinking all those thoughts. You're not thinking about patriotism, duty, and the folks back home. You have far more pressing, more urgent matters that completely occupy your mind right now. So how do you get the guys to go forwards? Well, SLA Marshall, in his Men Against Fire, he reported that commanding officers, particularly more senior ones, going around a battle, got the impression that everyone was doing their job. And it seems that this was for the same reason that the Queen thinks that the world smells of paint. Now, if you're British, you'll get that reference, but just in case you're not British, which is possible, let me explain. There is this gag shared by all British people that the Queen thinks that the world smells of paint. The idea being that she's constantly visiting hospitals and schools and various institutions that are being opened up, or having new wings added or whatever, or giving out awards and things. And of course, knowing that the Queen is just about to visit, they spruce the place up just in time for her visit. And that's why every time she goes into one of these buildings, there's always the smell of drying paint, because something somewhere has just been repainted. So if you are the Queen, you perhaps get the impression that that's the way the world smells. So if you are a commanding officer and you're wandering around a battlefield, you may get the impression that everyone's constantly doing their job and firing at the enemy. But actually the reason they're doing their job and firing at the enemy is that you are there. So they'd been hunkered down in their slit trenches and their foxholes, doing as little as possible and keeping out of harm's way as much as possible, perhaps having a smoke or whatever. And then, oh, the commanding officer's around. Quick, everyone, look busy, look competent, look brave. Maybe you've got a medal out of it. Look, sir. Look, sir. Oh, sorry, mate. I'm firing my. Look. Oh, yeah. So perhaps that's why commanding officers didn't realise how few men were actually fighting properly during battles. Now, the granddaddy of tactical psychology is a British guy called David Rowland, and based on information gleaned during World War II, he came up with some calculations to show how many anti-tank guns the NATO allies should be fielding to stop the steamroller attack that was expected, possibly that was feared at least, from the Warsaw Pact. And he thought fairly convincingly showed that anti-tank guns were the way to stop their tanks. But there was a very powerful tank lobby. The people who made tanks, which are very big and expensive things, were quite keen on making and selling lots of tanks. And there was this idea that tanks are better. If the enemy's got tanks, we should have tanks, right? But actually, if you're the defending force, an anti-tank gun can be better. It's much easier to conceal, it's much smaller, it's much cheaper, so you can have more of them. And the crew can be spread out more. You can have lots of guys with binoculars in the open air, and they're able to use their two eyes with the perspective that gives you, and then confirm with binoculars and then shout to each other, yeah, there's a target over there. You see 3 telegraph poles left of the big barn. Because you've got more eyes looking at the target. You're open air, you've got more room to load the gun, fire the gun, and you can have a very powerful anti-tank gun that doesn't have to have an enormous, noisy, difficult to move, expensive, attention-drawing chassis to carry it. And he reckoned that with the right crew, anti-tank guns could be perhaps 10 times more effective than tanks. Tanks, of course, being mobile, can use that mobility to get out of danger, which is something that anti-tank guns can't. So if the enemy is coming forwards and you've got an anti-tank gun, maybe it's better that you stay here and shoot the enemy rather than just try to get out of there. But anyway, the tank lobby, it seems, actually won the debate. Anyway, he was able to cite certain examples. So, for example, in the Second Battle of El Alamein, there was one 6-pounder gun that knocked out 7 enemy tanks, which is better than some regiments managed to achieve. It was crewed by a corporal, a sergeant, a lieutenant, and a lieutenant colonel. And when you get crews like that together, of guys with a lot of gumption, a lot of initiative, and a lot of keenness to get stuck in, and competence and all the rest of it, then it seems that anti-tank guns are tremendously effective. But if you've got a weapon that perhaps you don't have tremendous confidence in and no one's watching you and you feel a bit vulnerable, you might decide not to use it properly and just get out of there instead. And this is what happened with a lot of 2-pounder Portees. Now, at the start of World War II, the British had a standard anti-tank gun that was a 2-pounder. And almost every source you ever read about these will tell you, oh, it was a pop gun, it was ridiculously obsolete. No, actually, at the start of World War II, it was a pretty effective anti-tank gun. It had a good hit rate, it had a very high rate of fire, and that's really good, and a fast 360 traverse. And they found that they could portee them. That is, they could just stick it on the back of a lorry. Now, in desert warfare, a lorry is a very vulnerable thing. It's got no armour and it's got a rather high silhouette, so you don't feel particularly safe firing an anti-tank gun off the back of a lorry. And if no one is watching, you might decide, yeah, just to abandon things. But if you stick to your gun and get the full capability out of it, it was actually very effective. And it was very effective against even Panzer IVs. Admittedly, these would be the earlier Panzer IVs that weren't quite so heavily armoured. The quality of the crew, actually this became a problem in World War II. I've heard it said, for instance, that there were tank crews. A tank would get knocked out, it'd run over a mine, say, oh, immobilised, what can we do? Well, okay, abandoned tank guys, hatch is open, and the commander gets out, sends his men away, but thinks, oh, hang on, walks over to one of the other tanks in his troop, knocks on a hatch and says, right, you, oi, out. And he orders one of the lower ranking guys in that other tank out and he replaces him. So now you've got 2 commanders in one tank, and then that tank gets knocked out and those 2 commanders then join another tank. So then that tank's now got 3 commanders in it. And after a while you have sometimes tanks entirely crewed by officers, sometimes quite senior, but that's a lot of eggs in one basket. So orders came from on high to put a sock in it, chaps, and no more of that. Anyway, sorry, digression. Let's fast forward now to the 1960s and Yale University and their very, very famous scientific experiment. I don't want to spend ages describing it because you probably know about it. You know, it's the one where you've got a very serious, very credible, very grave guy with glasses. He's quite senior, nice suit with a lab coat over the top, clipboard. And he gets in 2 test subjects and says, right, well, one of you is actually going to be experimented on and the other one's just going to help me do the experimentation. And randomly, they pick one to go through into another room where they'll be spoken to just over the intercom. You won't be able to see them. And then the other one just sits down next to the chap with the clipboard, and he's actually the guy that is being experimented upon, because it wasn't really random. And the guy who went into the other room was actually in on it and was an actor. And he says, right, we're experimenting on the effects of punishment and reward on how good people are at answering questions. So they would ask a question, and if the guy got it wrong, he would get an electric shock. And it was the guinea pig's job to set the voltmeter to how much of a shock to give the guy, and then press the button to administer the shock. And then the guy over the intercom would go, oh, ow, oh, right, okay, so that'll be wrong then, I suppose. And then the next question, more electrical charge. Ow, how? That, whoa, would come over and each time more and more pain was being registered by an actor over the speaker, until the guy in the other room was pleading, no, stop, seriously, this is really painful, and I want to stop. And the man with the clipboard would say, they're absolutely fine. There's no way that any harm can come to them. Please, it's just a scientific experiment. It's necessary that we carry on. And you know what? Most people did, it turned out. I mean, you might think, no, I wouldn't. But most people, the substantial majority of people, would keep on obeying instructions. "Oh, okay, I was just told to do it," and would up and up and up the amount of electric current running through this person who was just pretending, until they would actually feign death. And then they would still, no, they'll be fine, there you go. They've gone quiet now. Please carry on with the experiment. It was amazing how far they would go with that. And various militaries around the world looked at this and thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if soldiers behave this way and whether there's something we ought to know about soldiers. So military equivalents of this were organised. For instance, there was one where you're on a firing range and there's a drill instructor saying, right, we need to test the effectiveness of this new sighting system on the rifle or whatever it was, and you have to fire a certain number of bullets, and he's noting stuff down on the clipboard. It's all very official, you understand. And you fire off a few shots, and then over an intercom, some guy working on the range down by the target is saying, "Whoa, watch your ricochets, guys. That something I definitely pinged off. I saw it hit the berm not far from me. Don't worry, it's perfectly safe." And after a while, another, "Hey guys, seriously, that missed me by just like 10 feet or something. Could you really watch it? Don't worry, he's perfectly safe. It's all been tested. Carry on with the experiment." And then bang over the, "Hey, that just missed me. Holy cats, I got a hole in my uniform." And again, they would keep going until they actually caused an accident. They didn't, of course, cause any accident. The guy on the intercom was an actor in on it. But again, same sort of idea. That's interesting. And there was another one with an experiment on stealing air. And this one involved people jumping out of an aircraft with parachutes, and they would supposedly try to get the parachutes to open at the same height. So if this parachute opened first, then maybe it would steal the air rushing that way. That means that this parachute doesn't open properly, and this guy then possibly suffers. Would people actually do this? And one of the interesting things they found was that a soldier would often be willing to accept risk for himself, and he might accept a stranger, his actions to cause a stranger to be at risk. But soldiers were extremely reluctant to take some action that would put one of their mates at risk. Another thing they found out is that the grave, credible experimenter who's giving them the instructions that they're supposed to obey, if he was a well-respected sergeant, that sometimes worked better than an officer who was considered a bit of what the Americans would call a pencil neck. I've had a few emails from charming Americans calling me a pencil neck. Well, sorry, I'm doing my best. The British Army perhaps would call them Ruperts. Same sort of thing. In case you don't get that reference, an awful lot of British Army officers are from aristocratic backgrounds, and a lot of upper class people in Britain are called Rupert, which of course you realise is just the same name as Robert, but spelt differently, as in, Rupert the Bruce. Anyway, so they found out that yes, soldiers did actually have this psychology in common with those people who were administering the electric shocks. So leadership, therefore, clearly has a marked effect. If there's someone who is credible telling you to do something, then you are surprisingly likely to do it. Well, I was ordered to do it, so he knew what he was talking about. Presumably, had a clipboard and everything, or he had pips on his shoulder, or whatever it was that gave him this credibility to make these people do whatever was required of them. There's a drill that has been taught since World War I, I'm pretty sure, in the British Army, and so there are records of it going back a very long time, and the results are instructive. So in this drill, there is an enemy, a known enemy. You are told how many enemy there are and what weapons they've got, and they're just over there, and they're only 100 yards away. So that should make the situation pretty safe and easy to deal with, because you're dealing with so many knowns. And there's another unit somewhere that is pouring suppressive fire onto them, keeping them suppressed. And your job, your section's job, is to get in there with grenades, bayonets, and right, hand up, Jean-Paul or Fritz or whoever it's going to be, and come on, and to do the job, to actually take the position from the enemy to win the battle. And privates are amazingly reluctant to do this, even though, and it's only a simulation of course, so nobody actually dies, but even in the simulation there's a 90% survival rate of the guys who go in to take the position. But even then they're really reluctant, or if reluctance not quite the word, they just don't have the initiative to do it. I don't know quite what's going on. Why should I follow you? If you just have a load of privates there, they don't do anything. It takes someone, a commander more senior than the section commander, a sergeant or a platoon commander, a lieutenant, has to come along and lead them, and then they'll do it. Now, a private on his own, under combat, in a combat situation, seems to have about less than a 20% chance of initiating violence. An NCO, that's corporals and sergeants, people like that, more like 40%. A really good NCO, senior NCO, or an officer, it's somewhere around 70%. Of course, you never get to 100%. But the more senior you go, the more likely it is that these people will initiate some violence somehow, get people moving forwards, doing the job. This involves, of course, quite often leading by example. Now, there are various factors that will lower this chance, but under ideal conditions with a good officer, you're 6 times more likely to get an attack going in. You're 6 times more likely to get an attack to happen if you've got a good leader under ideal conditions. I say ideal conditions, if it's dark or you're in a jungle or confused maze of buildings or whatever. So if vision is blocked by smoke or whatever it is, so people can't see each other, then it can be more difficult to get things to happen. You might charge forward, a few guys go with you, but the other guys are going, where's everyone gone? Where's everyone gone? And not knowing where you've gone, they don't go charging forwards because they don't know that you've gone forwards necessarily. Maybe you went backwards, and so they just stay where they are, or just look stupid and ask a lot of questions. But good units, elite units, well-trained, experienced troops will clearly do a lot better in these situations. And it seems that one of the main reasons for this is that if someone at least half decent steps up and says, oh, okay, I don't know where the officer is, he seems to have gone, but if you'll follow me, I'll lead us in. And if you're in an elite unit, you've probably got trust in that other guy. You've probably served with him for a while. You've probably got confidence that he does actually know what he's doing. So, okay, if someone half decent steps up, fair enough, we're going to follow this guy and get the job done, because being an elite unit, you're reasonably experienced, you probably know what the job is that has to be done and what needs to be done to get it done. So, fair enough, in we'll go. Which means that elite units degrade very slowly as officers get lost, get killed, go missing for whatever reasons. The other troops are able to carry on. Under intense combat conditions, non-elite units, in non-elite units, privates will almost never initiate violence. So if you are trying to come up with some war game rules, for instance, doesn't matter what the period, doesn't matter, the Wars of the Roses, so you've got, let's say, peasants and men-at-arms and knights, just to have 3 very broad categories. If you actually want the troops who are peasants to do anything, then you need a good sergeant-at-arms or a good knight to be with them and make sure that they do actually move and do something, because otherwise the likelihood is they'll just stand around chewing the cud or slowly march towards, slowly saunter, just sort of amble, just sort of sidle, that's what they do, they sidle to the rear and out of harm's way. Right, so I think now it's probably time for me to pick up my uke. And let's see where, now it's time for a word or two that the sponsor wants to deliver to you. Yes, it is sponsor time. It's actually quite difficult to play a uke, which is quite shiny, with a skinny sweater like that. Anyway, I'm not sure how much that did. But anyway, yes, sponsor time. And my sponsor for this video is Audible. So thank you very much, Audible. And Audible has an offer on. Yes, if you go to www.audible.com/Lindybeige, or particularly if you're in America, I think this works best, you text Lindybeige to 500 500, then you can take advantage of an offer. Yes, you can get 3 months for the knockdown price of just $6.95, which is under half the usual price. And what do you get for that? What is Audible? Well, I'll tell you. Audible has the world's biggest collection of audiobooks, and you get one of those per month for that price, and on top of that, in addition as well, you get that's two audio, well, you can if you want, you don't have to, they're not forced on you, two audible originals. An original being something you can't get anywhere else. And they have pretty famous people like these involved in those audible originals. So they're not not to be scoffed or sniffed at. We'll have none of that scoffing or sniffing. You can of course own these things forever. You're not renting them. It's not a streaming service. You download the thing. It's yours. It's your property to keep forever and ever. And you can even share one with a friend once. You can play it on all sorts of devices as well, not just your computer. That's right, even on telephones. I don't understand how that's possible, but apparently you can play this stuff even on telephones these days. Assuming they're not joking about that. Anyway, there are features, unique. Here's some features that are unique to Audible. There you go, features. That's enough about the features. The point is that Audible's got its act together on this front, and I would possibly recommend the junior. Well, I do, in fact, recommend the Junior Officers Reading Club. By a chap called Patrick Hennessy, who's also the voice you will hear reading the audiobook. So it's narrated by the author, which I think is often nice. And he tells his story of how he became an officer in the British Army. The first part of the book is he is growing up, joining the army, being trained and having his first few postings. That, for instance, he was one of the guards at the Tower of London for a while. But he talks about this quite taboo subject, of how keen he was and all the guys around him to get into action, get into a real scrap, and how near insanely jealous he was of the guys who'd actually been out there and come back with dirt on their uniforms that showed that, yeah, they'd seen action and their camouflage uniforms were faded under the sun, and when he saw them in the airport, he just thought, oh, I want to be one of those. And when he got into action, he also talks about, again, a bit of a taboo subject, the highs he felt, how exhilarating he found being in combat. Something which I found was a bit frustrating, a bit annoying, is that he was almost silent on the nuts and bolts of the tactics he was using. So he would say, oh, we fought our way from here to there, and you just, how? What exactly did you do? What orders did you give? What was but on the psychology, it's not tactical psychology, it's a different sort of psychology. He's talking about the desires and feelings that soldiers have. He's very good, and he eventually left the army, though later he went back to Afghanistan as a reporter, but he left the army because he found himself thinking, I'm not in love with this guy I appear to be becoming. He would, when he was on leave back in Britain, go to some really dodgy pubs, and after a while he was thinking, why am I going to all these dodgy pubs? Oh right, yeah, I'm hoping something's going to kick off. I'm hoping there's going to be some trouble. I'm hoping someone's going to challenge me so I can rise slowly from my seat, crack my knuckles and say, oh dear, you picked on the wrong guy. I've killed people and I don't mind adding to the list. And he thought, oh, I don't want to be that guy. So he got out of the army and wrote this book. And now, if you go to www.audible.com/Lindybeige or text Lindybeige to 500 you, for just $6.95 per month, can listen to that audiobook or any of loads of others. So, thanks Audible. Right, now, moving on. One of the things that gets guys to go forward is the fellowship of the other guys around them. If you're in a group of guys who are all going forwards in a determined manner, it's much more likely that you too will go forwards in a determined manner. And when people observe hunter-gatherers fighting, they notice that they have these loose, dispersed formations that almost never really get to grips with the enemy. The guys have often got javelins, the like, and maybe a shield, spears and other things, but javelins are commonly the main weapon, maybe some bows, and they get to a certain distance from each other when a javelin is a threat, but if you got much closer, you'd be able to threaten one of the enemy more, but several of the enemy will be able to threaten you, so you don't actually charge out of your formation that far forward because it's too much of a risk to you. So you end up with these formations that just sort of posture at each other for a while and exchange the occasional javelin throw. But a javelin or even an arrow from the shot at distance, if it's just one, it's quite easy to see and to dodge, and you've got all your various mates who will point out to you in case there's a javelin coming in from that side you haven't seen, and someone will shout, Lionel, and whoa, oh, thanks Neville. You know, you'll be you'll be fairly safe, and casualties amongst those sort of engagements are very, very low. And in fact, of course, in the ancient world, there were skirmishers who did precisely that job. They were usually young men, again, armed with javelins and the like, missile weapons, who were not expected to close with the enemy. Yes, they had swords and other weapons just in case that happened, but they were not expected. That wasn't their prime job. They were for screening the army as it deployed in tough, big, dense blocks of armoured men, the heavy infantry behind, and when the army was ready to advance, the skirmishers would then fall back, and the guys who were expected to close with the enemy, then they would advance. And if they saw their own skirmishers running past them the other way, it wouldn't bother them that much, because, well, skirmishers always fall back. That's once they've done their job, that's to be expected. So it wouldn't dismay the heavy infantry going forward to see their skirmishers running at speed in the opposite direction. Now, in Alexander the Great's time, he was a big fan of the phalanx, of massive phalanx of pikemen. And a phalanx, yes, it was quite a deep formation, but it was also, in his day, a very, very wide formation. It was most of the guys in the army. And most of those guys are in the middle of that phalanx formation with what is essentially a very long stick, a pike. So they're not going to be fussing about. They can't be saying, oh, I've got to check the frequencies on my radio. I've got to check that the ejector port on this is working, and whether this thing is oiled. And you don't have anything complicated like that you've got an excuse to fuss with. You've got a stick. Oh, I've got to make sure that my stick is a stick. Yeah, it's a stick. Okay, right. You've got no excuse for fussing with anything, because you're just a guy carrying a stick, and you're surrounded by guys shoulder to shoulder, right around you in a dense formation. If everyone's walking forwards, it's really difficult for you to do anything other, frankly, than walk forwards. And if you tried doing anything other than walk forwards, everyone would notice. And they would have the equivalent of corporals, I suppose, as file leaders. So the front of every file would have a guy who's a little bit more senior. On the corners, you'd have the more senior commanders, and the guys at the back and down the sides as well would be more experienced. So you've got a thin crust of the experienced guys on the outside, the better troops, if you like, but the great mass of men, the equivalent of the privates of a modern army, would just be in the middle, and you could give them all the same order, which essentially is follow the guy in front of you. Oh, and don't forget your stick. And that could contribute quite handily to the winning of a battle. In the case of Alexander the Great, did on numerous occasions. Now, the pike, of course, was a weapon that retained its popularity for a while and came back, particularly in the pike and shot era. So Gustav Adolphus and his lot, and in the English Civil War, you've got these pike blocks, but they tend to be much smaller and more isolated. And they're also horribly vulnerable to a new thing on the battlefield, which was gunpowder artillery. A couple of big cannonballs shot into a pike formation could really cause quite a mess. So it did happen sometimes that these pike blocks would disintegrate at distance from the enemy, never having got to grips with the enemy at all. But that sort of didn't matter all that much. But because they were small and isolated, they were just one little bit of the army. The army as a whole could carry on without one of those pike blocks. But if the Alexandrian phalanx went, that was most of the army. So that would mean that they'd lost the battle. If the Macedonian phalanx broke up and routed, that would be the end of the battle. All the other guys, even if they were doing quite well, would think, oh, most of us seem to be running away. I think I'll do the same. Oh, I'm on a horse. That's handy. So the more eggs you've got in that basket, the more risk you're taking. So the more cohesion you've got of a unit, that's great for going forwards. Though, of course, the flip side of the coin is that the more cohesion you've got in a unit, if you start going backwards, everyone starts going backwards. Now, there was a chap called Colonel Charles J. Ardent du Pic, who's, you probably guessed it, French, and he died in the Franco-Prussian War, and he made an awful lot of observations in his day. And in his day, the columns going forwards were quite narrow. And he discovered that, for instance, trying to push a column of men forwards, it was futile. You push from the back of a column, and if you push hard, then some men just fall over. If you push, sometimes they lie down, or they just get out of the way. And you've probably seen, haven't you, as I have on a few occasions. If you ever go to some kung fu event or some event where the kung fu is being, or something like kung fu is being demonstrated, there are these kung fu charlatans out there, and one of the amazing feats that they like to demonstrate is how that they can push 20 men. I have the strength of 20 men. So they get into a decent stance on the floor, and they push a guy who has another guy pushing like that with his arms out in front on his back, and this guy another guy's got his hands there, and there's another guy, and there are 20 guys in a line in single file, all with their arms out like this. There's lots of air between them, lots of room for movement between them all. And well, would you believe it, these 20 guys can't push the kung fu charlatan out of the way, who stands there like a rock. Isn't he amazing? Not really, because you know exactly what's going to happen. If you push a wonky thing with all that wobble in it, you just know that it's going to go off sideways. So all the guy at the front has to do is have a good stance and just redirect the force of the guy at the front, and it's going to throw the whole column out every single time. They're never going to be able to push him. I want to see I want to see a load of those guys form a really effective tight rugby scrum with shoulders, arms hooked around each other and shoulders all locked together, and then, yeah, see if you can push those 20 guys back. Then we'll see if you're actually stronger than 20 guys. Sorry, it's a bit of a digression, but anyway. So he noticed that pushing columns was a bit futile, and he reported that when columns did go charging in, the usual result was that the enemy, oh hell, would run away. Great, job done. But if the enemy were stubborn and didn't run away, the guys at the front would, charging forward, start running a little bit more slowly, because they didn't actually want to get into grips with the enemy, because that's horrible. They've got bayonets and we've got bayonets, and it'll be all bayonety and nasty. And so the guys then behind them, they've got guys running behind them, and they've got to find some room to go, so they start spreading out. And the head of the column then gets dispersed and loses momentum, and everything comes to a sort of halt. And a lot of guys end up starting a firefight at very short range with the enemy, which of course involves an awful lot of casualties to both sides. It would have been far fewer people would have actually got killed if they'd just gone in, but it's really difficult to close with someone who's got a bayonet. Men are naturally averse to doing that. And quite often, when they did go in against stubborn opposition, the first 3 rows would get minced. But you're feeding more men in with this great big column, and so you should still carry the day. And he reckoned that it was about the 6th rank back that decided whether there was going to be a rout or not. If the guys in the 6th rank back decided, okay, right, this attack's not working, and they turned and fled, they were the guys who were likely to carry the whole column back in disarray. Now, if I'm not sure how much it is true of the youth of today, but people my age and older, back through time, if you're male, you've probably taken a beating at some point in your life. You've probably got set upon by some older, bigger boys at school or after school, and you got a big, thorough kicking, and you just know how horrendous that was. And so you imagine when you become an adult, wow, adults can dish out an awful lot more damage than those kids who beat me up can dish out. So yeah, that's really nasty. I don't want any part of that. And in some periods they would put the young men in the front rank, because those are the guys who are still cocky, still keen, still optimistic, and haven't seen the full horrors of war. And maybe they get paid double for being in the front rank. So that's pretty good too. Eh? I'm a front ranker. Oh yeah, ladies, listen. Yeah, why don't you sit at my table in the inn, because I'm a double pay front rank guy. Well, the more experienced troops had seen enough and never really wanted to be in the front rank. And it is thought, Dave Grossman, for instance, quotes in On Killing, he comes up with this 2% figure. This figure comes up again and again, 2%. It's an estimate of the number of men, the proportion of men who are not averse to killing up close and personal. It's only about 2%. So 98% of men really don't want to get up close to the enemy with the sharp, pointy things. Now, it's thought that maybe 5 to 10% of men can become immune if they've experienced enough victories. If they've gone in and won enough times against the enemy, they might be not exactly keen and willing, but at least not particularly averse to going in and getting into close melee, close face-to-face melee with the enemy. But that's still a substantial majority who don't want to do that, and it's true that all men, including even the 2%, would far rather kill the enemy at a distance from safety if they possibly could. I'm going to go to World War I Palestine. So World War I Palestine illustrates this reasonably well, in that they did a study looking at where the bodies had fallen relative to a position that got taken off the enemy. And they were looking at successful attacks. So you've got some trenches here, for instance, and then bodies at various distances from that trench as the attack went in to take the trench. And they would see that beyond 400 yards, not that many casualties, and a lot of those casualties were able to be escorted to the rear, to a field station or whatever. But about 400 yards, significant casualties are being taken, and fatalities too. And so at 400 yards there are bodies and splats of blood on the ground that are countable. And then at 200 yards there were, twice as many as at 400 yards, and at 100 yards twice as many again. So it's 4 times the number of 400 yards. So it's doubling, as you would sort of expect. But then at 50 yards, the line on the graph suddenly does a weird reverse, and the number of casualties at 50 yards goes steeply down. And at 20 yards, there are fewer men being killed in this successful attack than were being killed at 400 yards. So what's going on? This requires an explanation. Well, you could say, machine guns. An awful lot of the men are being killed by machine guns. Oh, I should have said, by the way, that these engagements were all small arms. So it's machine guns and rifles doing almost all the killings. Machine guns do an awful lot of the killing, and at long range, if you've got loads of guys there, the machine gunner, if he's got his sight sets right, can, with a very small movement, he can strafe all of those guys, and the bullets are quite close together, small movement, yeah, that's why machine guns are quite effective at that long range. But when you get really close, then the machine gun has to traverse. It's really difficult as the guys get closer and the bullets are spreading out more. And so that's it. It's machine guns less effective. Well, yeah, it's a factor, but it doesn't seem to explain this degree of change. And surely at closer range, those guys with rifles who would fill in, that they would be scoring more hits because the enemy's closer, therefore easier to hit, as was proven by the fact that they were hitting more of them at 100 yards than at 400 yards. Okay, so maybe it's losses, of course. By the time the enemy gets to 20 yards, they're probably close enough to start causing significant losses in the defenders, so there are then fewer defenders to shoot back. Yeah, absolutely. That's a factor too. Or could it be, and I've read several accounts that put it down to this, that the foolish defenders forgot to set their sights again. So they were firing accurately at 400 yards, but by the time the enemy got to 100 yards, they still had their sights set to 400 yards. Their bullets were often going over the top of people's heads, and by the time they got to 20 yards, really? You could miss at 20 yards? I always found that because I've been reading accounts of that, even against light cavalry charges, World War I Australian light cavalry charges that sometimes got away with almost no casualties. And it's because the enemy didn't remember to reset their sights. Really? You can miss a horse and rider at 20 yards because your sights weren't set right? I never sort of bought that. I always thought something else must be happening. And it seems that, well, something else is happening. There was another study actually that showed that to 200 yards, about 2/3 of the men are actually fighting. About 1 man in 20 is not exactly running away, but doing something very similar to running away, finding something to do that keeps him out of harm's way. And the rest are just sort of fussing and faffing about and not really getting anything done. And by the time you get to 20 yards, yes, sorry, that's right. By the time you get to 20 yards, only about 1 man in 5 is actually effectively fighting. About half the men are now faffing about, fussing, doing goodness knows whatever. It seems that sometimes they will find a rock to hide behind and they'll have a smoke and start swapping photographs. Although this tends not to get recorded in any of the official records, but it seems that does actually happen. And the rest are running away. So a tiny proportion of men are actually effectively fighting at the front. And in World War II, I read again and again and again, there's a company attack, and it's a platoon officer, a sergeant, and one other guy. Often it's just 3 guys who actually go into the building and take it off the enemy, throw in the grenades, do the last thing that needed to be done to win the action. If you're Finnish, then you will at school have read War Story, which is also called The Unknown Soldier. It depends on whether it's the Bowdlerized version or not. This is his account of Finns fighting Russians in World War II, principally in the Continuation War. It makes super clear over and over again that it's the actions of 1 or 2 men, even in quite large battles, that makes a difference between victory and defeat. I was really struck by that when reading that book. And don't forget that these are in successful attacks. So you imagine that in failed attacks, all those figures that I was mentioning before are presumably worse than that. Now then, there is this concept of the LSP, the last safe position or point or place. And this is the point at which a certain equation balances. So imagine you are here. This is your starting position, and you have to get to here to take the position off the enemy. And there are various forces that carry you in that direction. You've been given orders. You're hearing the trumpets blare, and you've been trained loads of times. When the trumpet plays that thing, you go forwards. So you associate that with going forwards. Okay, I'm going forwards, and all your mates are going forwards, and they're shouting forwards like that. You see, so okay, right, forwards and forwards you go, dum da dum da dum. And so you're carrying forwards, following orders. Everything's great. You have the leadership. People have told you, given you definite orders to go forwards, and you've got the cohesion with the guys around you. Yes, let's go forwards. Okay, so you go forwards, and then there are forces that force you in this direction, or at least to come to a halt, and they involve that the enemy is really big and scary and has guns and don't have your best interests at heart, and it's really dangerous to get close to them. And there is a point at which the equation balances, and that's when troops tend to come to a halt. And it seems that if troops have got, say, spears, that the LSP might be about 5 yards, which is just outside spear range. If in the musket era, it was perhaps 20 yards. And there are loads of accounts of musket fights, even in buildings and so forth, with guys firing muskets with dirty great big bayonets on the end, but then not charging in, and instead frantically reloading their muskets. I don't want to go over there, they've got bayonets. Yeah, but if you stand where you are, you're more likely to be shot. And if you charge over there, they're very likely to run away. But it's very difficult to get guys to close with the enemy, which is one of my main points. You've probably spotted that. Well done. So at the last safe point, it seems that people start coming to a halt. With an AK-47, it's at about 50 yards. And didn't I say that in Palestine, they found that at about 50 yards, the graph started going the other way? Yeah, it seems to be a related point. So people, and you probably yourself have personal experience of the LSP. Remember that time you were in the playground and you'd been wronged by that other kid who's in the year above you, slightly bigger than you, but he was a bit of a git, no one liked him, but somehow he had a few friends that always went around with him, and all your friends said, yeah, he's really wronged you and you should sort this out, and we'll back you up. And you go up to him in the playground and say, well, you did a bad thing, but I'll let you off if you apologise. And he stands there with a smug, he's trying to intimidate you, understand, smile, and you say, well, come on then, if you're hard enough. What do you mean about hard enough? I just wanted you to apologise. I'm right here if you want to have a go. Well, I'm right here if you want to have a go. Do you think the distance between you and me is different from the distance between me and you? Well, it's not. It's exactly the same. If you say, I'm right here, well, I'm right here. That's a completely nonsensical argument. You see, and you have this posturing argument just outside punching range. Just outside punching range, and you know that if he were to go for you, you could step back and, oh yeah, I had you, yeah, you coward. You're doing all that. You were at the LSP, and then one of your friends who just wants to see a fight says, go on, get him, and he shoves you forward, and then you're within punching range, and then the guy is going to look really silly if he doesn't punch you, and you think, I can't stop and turn around and go back faster than he can throw a punch. So you start windmilling with your arms because you're only 8 years old or whatever, you don't know what you're doing, and an actual punching match starts because you've gone past that point of you've gone past the last safe position, so you've gone into an unsafe position. You now have to fight. So you have that personal experience, and it's happened many times in Afghanistan, for instance, in recent times, that fights have started already past the LSP, because maybe you're in one of those compounds with the high walls, high adobe mud brick walls, and contact is made with the enemy at very close range. And the British or American, the Allied force is quite dispersed. And so there are guys only 20 yards behind who can't see what's going on and are in no position to help. But they hear some fighting, and instinctively they'll freeze and look around and perhaps wait for orders, but the officer's not with them, and they're not getting any useful information over the radios if they have radios. And so all the fighting ends up being done by those poor saps at the front who are already past the LSP when things kick off. So it seems that actually modern armies in that context are using the wrong tactics, because if you take into account the psychology of humans and what causes people to fight well in battles, that's not a conducive way to go about things. And it seems that at the LSP, at the last safe point, only about a quarter of the men who were fighting at distance, and don't forget that's not everyone either, only about a quarter of those men will actually still be fighting at the LSP. Yeah, this is a problem that armies have yet to solve. How do you get guys to close with the enemy?